With the release of Phantom Monarchs, we are now once again going into an open format. Luxem loves an open format because we already have an established deck archetype and we already know what options are available to us. However, as your locals continues to evolve and different decks continue to go in and out of the meta, I'm hoping to provide a resource where you can figure out what kind of options you want to put in and potentially take out depending on how your locals shape up. In front of us, we have our 10 most important regalia that I believe every Serene Fire Luxem deck will be running in PTM moving forward. This video was recorded on December 15th. This is prior to a potential Mercenaries Blade ban, so if Mercenaries Blade is banned in the future, please take out Mercenaries Blade from this list and you will only have 9 core cards. So let's take a quick look. We have our Spirit of Serene Fire, Zander 1, 2, and 3, a off-turn option such as Backup Charger, our Divine Relic, which in this case is Lost Providence, Mercenaries Blade, and then 3 flex spots, of which they are Safeguard Amulet, Chalice of Blood, and Insignia of the Korhazi. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Lost Providence is an amazing divine relic, and yes, it will win you games by itself. However, it's your skill and the options you put into your deck that will win you more games than this divine relic ever could. So if you do not have a Lost Providence at the moment, I think your deck will be fine with a GCR or a Quicksilver Grail, and you play with the deck, learn the ins and outs of it, and by the time you get Lost Providence, which will be reprinted in RDO, you should be able to pilot the deck quite efficiently. I'm going to go into the 3 flex spots, Chalice, Safeguard, and Insignia, a little bit later in the video. So, without further ado, let's go on into the main deck. So, in my opinion, there are 47 core cards in a Serene Fire Luxem Zander list. As you can see, we have the most important card in the deck, which is a 4 of Dungeon Guide. We have the Float Engine, which consists of 4 Creative Shock, 4 Gentle Respite, and 4 Return to Archive. Now, currently, because Mercenaries Blade is not banned, I believe that Return to the Archive is one of the best float options we have available because it allows us to go from 1 to 2 extremely efficiently. It also allows us to go from 2 to 3 efficiently if we do not see a dungeon guide. And in a case where we do see Dungeon Guide and we have all of these options, we can discard it using Creative Shock, we can use it as cost, we can imbue it for Topsy Decree. It's even as a dead card, it's a non-dead card, and Topsy Decree is very strong in this format. Gentle Respite is my floating memory of choice here because going first, you have 6 influence with Serene, and your opponent will have 7, assuming they're on a regular spirit. If you play Gentle Respite going first, they will have to go down to 5 in order to match you in terms of influence. So most likely you will be getting a +1 of Gentle Respite going first a lot of the time. And if you're not going first, you can simply just hold it in your hand and pitch it to Creative Shock. So I believe that Creative Shock, Gentle Respite, and Return to Archive is a very strong package here for 8 float plus 4 creative. However, you can bump that up to 10 float if you'd like, and I'll go over the options a little bit later. We have Juggle Knives, which is my de facto neutral assassin card, which I'll also get to later, as well as our core Luxem cards. Luxem, in terms of the ratio of Luxem to Norn in a deck, I prefer it to be somewhere along the lines of 16 to 19 Luxem. However, I'll get into the specifics of why we choose that number in a later part of the video. So, going on ahead, 47 cards means that 13 of the cards are yours for the choosing. Now, depending on your playstyle, depending on your meta, you can pick and choose the options that are best for you. The next 2 slides, I'm going to go over just a couple of the most common options, but not all of them. So let's take a quick look. In terms of regalia, you might want to put in more draw regalia, such as Portentous Tangu. If you find yourself running 10 float instead of the traditional 8 or 9, you might want to consider a blinding orb so that you can banish excess float once you're level 3 in order to get a free GCR-like effect. It's also great to put your opponent's hands down even before the Zander trigger to ensure that you'll kill on your combo turn. Some common main deck options you might see are exploit vulnerability over Juggle Knives, and the reason for this is if you're playing a low influence build, let's say for example, you're running not Lost Providence, you're running a Quicksilver Grail or something along those lines. When you're level 3 and you're low on influence, you could potentially materialize an insignia of the Korhazi and then play a prepared exploit vulnerability pre-recollection and then trigger the insignia of the Korhazi in order to draw one into memory and then draw one off exploit and then recollect and then you're off to the races there. Fast Cure and Reprogram are the traditional fast speed float options, as well as Luxor's Map and Tariff Ring are the most common regalia that you'll see in a standard Luxem Zander deck. Some additional options depending on the flavor of the month or depending on your locals include Vanish from Sight, Planted Explosives, Reduced to Ash, and sometimes in a very slime-heavy format or a format with a lot of small creatures, you might want to consider a Sadie or even a Sable Remnant. Sable Remnant is a very old tech where you could play Sable Remnant, get some advantage, and then later in the game you can actually reprogram that Sable Remnant away and then be able to use both floating memory effects. So, I know at the beginning I mentioned that there are 10 solid slots in Serene Fire Luxem Zander, but in reality, there are only really 6 slots that are guaranteed in any Fire Luxem Zander deck. Now, those slots are your Serene Spirit, your Zanders 1 through 3, one off-turn regalia, in this case it's Backup Charger, and your Divine Relic, in which case this is Lost Providence is by far the best Divine Relic for us at the moment. So this basically means that the next 6 cards in your regalia are yours for the choosing, essentially, depending on the format, depending on the cards available to you, but the deck itself cannot function without these 6 cards. In terms of the deck's most important core cards, there are 32 of them. Like I mentioned before, there is the Creative Shock plus 8 float engine. You can go up to 10 float if you'd like. There's the Dungeon Guide 4 of. There's 4 Juggle Knives that can also be exploit vulnerability instead. I usually try to aim for maybe 6 to 10 neutral assassin cards, and the reason for this is pretty simple. Let's say you're starting off the game, you play Creative Shock, discarding a float, you level to 1 using that float that you discarded, but you can't actually level to Zander 2 unless you have a target in your grave. And sometimes when you have something like Incapacitate, what if your opponent is playing all allies? They don't want any action, you're not going to be able to use Incapacitate, it's sitting in your hand, and you're feeling kind of weird that you can't really level to 2. So that's why you want something like Juggle Knives, that's why you want something like Exploit Vulnerability, or even Thieving Cut. I really like Thieving Cut because it does allow you to remove an ally from the board and draw one, but it is a risky option because if your opponent interacts with your Thieving Cut in any way, you can lose the prep counter, have the battle negated with a Song of Frost, and then you are very behind on tempo. So sometimes it's correct to just thieving cut your opponent instead of thieving cut an ally because that way they can't Zephyr it, they can't bounce it, they can't reclaim it. It's a little bit of a safer play, but generally Juggle Knife and Exploit Vulnerability are safer options if you want to ensure a level 2 Zander reclaim of a assassin card. What you can also do is if you have 2 Juggle Knives in hand, you can play Juggle Knives, go to 2, and then with the trigger on the stack, pass opportunity to your opponent, see if they want to interact with you. If they decide to banish your Juggle Knives, you can also just play another Juggle Knives after they play their banish card, and then also keep your target. Unfortunately, this doesn't work with Topsy Decree, but I'll get into that a little bit later. The last 3 cards in our core Luxem build are the Lightweaver's Assault, the Luxem Sight, and the Gleaming Cut. Honestly, all you really need is Lightweaver's Assault in order to win the game. When you have 2 Lightweavers available to you, on the turn when you can trigger its ability, and you put 2 of them face down, basically due to a backup charger effect or an insignia effect. In your recollection, you reveal both of them. You'll ping your opponent for 4 damage. When you recollect and draw, if you have 10 cards in hand At any point in time, you could play Light Weavers, hold priority, and play another Light Weavers for 16 damage. 16 plus the 4 that you dealt at the beginning is 20 damage, which means that if you did any ping damage throughout the course of the game, it's very easy to present lethal with just 2 Light Weavers assaults. The Luxem sights allow you to live against the aggro decks, against mid-range decks that are pushing damage to you all game, and the Gleaming Cut helps you just accrue influence to hit that critical 10 influence that you need to resolve double Light Weaver's assault. Now we get to the fun part. I mentioned earlier that we always run 4 Juggle Knives, or we run 4 of Exploit Vulnerability, but in some cases you might actually want to run more. Now, I feel that 4 to 6 is the right number for a neutral assassin card, but depending on your meta, you might actually want to consider either Vanish from Sight or Planted Explosives instead. The reason being, Vanish from Sight single-handedly gets you to 3 without needing to rely on dungeon guides or float or whatnot, because what you can do is, on your opponent's turn, you Vanish from Sight, on your turn, you banish 2, go to level 2, pick up the Vanish from Sight, and then do nothing, pass turn to your opponent, play Vanish from Sight again, and then you can hard level to 3 and pick up your Vanish from Sight. This means that you are able to go from 2 to 3 efficiently without needing to rely on dungeon guides in case your opponent's Stifling Trap or whatnot. So Vanish from Sight is a nice consistency piece, but it's only useful against decks that use allies or decks that use attacks that don't have true sight. So depending on your meta, you may or may not want to mainboard a Vanish from Sight. Planted Explosives allows you to deal with some tricky creatures. For example, Cheshire Cat has Stealth and Spell Shroud, but Planted Explosives is a skill. So you can actually get through Stealth and Spell Shroud. If your opponent is piloting Genbu and they choose to go for a Genbu attacking combo, switching their attack and defense and running into you, before damage is dealt, you can actually plant explosives targeting the Genbu, which will now have 3 defense only. Even if they pump up their defense further, that'll only increase their attack. So Planted Explosives gets through to kill a Genbu on their attack turn. Keep in mind, though, that if they are Gorja level 3, they can release the Gorja 2 and basically nullify your Planted Explosives turn. However, if you have 2 Planted Explosives, you can Planted Explosives, have forced the release, and then Planted Explosives again, and you're very well insulated against that combo. So I would say Juggle Knives is your main 4. You might consider some copies of Exploit Vulnerability. Then you would want to consider Vanish from Sight if your locals is ally heavy, and you might want to consider Planted Explosives if something like a Cheshire Cat is causing you problems, Genbu combo is causing you problems, even Arthur. So for example, if your opponent wants to play Arthur and Immortal, it's an on-enter trigger, which means that they can play Arthur. They say, okay, on enter, I'll rest Arthur and gain immortality. In response to the on-enter trigger, you can Planted Explosives their Arthur, prepared, deal 4 damage, and even though they wanted to play it Immortal, it's dead. So Planted Explosives gets around that. Thieving Cut is an all-around good solution. Even if your opponent's not playing allies, you can just push the damage to the champion, so you can hit that threshold for lethal a little bit earlier. However, the downside for Thieving Cut is it uses that prepared counter, so that it reduces the likelihood you'll be able to resolve, return to the archives later, and it also reduces your ability to go for early striking Illuminance. So Thieving Cut comes in and out of the meta depending on what you need. Exploit Vulnerability is very useful if you're trying to deal with a Shenju or something that just won't die, like the big deer from Merlin. If you exploit vulnerability on yourself, you can gain essentially Death Touch for the turn, so you can attack with a Thieving Cut, attack into their 9 health ally or whatever, and you'll instantly kill it, assuming you deal any damage. So Exploit Vulnerability is an anti-Shenju tool that allows you to also draw influence if you're low on influence later in the game with Insignia of the Kohazi. So I typically like to aim for maybe 8 to 10 copies of the 5 cards that we see in front of us, and these go in and out of the meta depending on what I'm seeing at locals. Most Luxem Zander lists run some amount of Scry the Skies and one turbocharge. In previous formats, for example, the format where we had liminal guides and the Ryle engine, we would cut Scry the Skies because the purpose of this package, this 3 to 5 card package, is to increase the consistency of your deck and reduce the amount of variance that you get from clumping and like just bricking with your Luxem cards. The reason is this: if you Scry the Skies early, say for example, you have all yellow cards in your hand, you can't really do anything, you're kind of locked out of the game, you have two options. You can backup charger and not crack it so that on your following turn you can pay for backup charger and then use the three that you paid, the three yellow cards that you paid to level, which is not ideal. Or you can play Scry the Skies, paying with a Luxem card that you don't want, look at the top of your deck, put it into your memory. If it's a dungeon guide, you know that you can use it later and level efficiently, so you're good to go. You're good to go. But if it's another brick, if it's another Luxem card, you could just banish both of them or either of them in order to level up. So Scry the Skies fixes your hand if you're clumping. So I typically recommend 3 to 5 copies. I've gone as low as 3 Scry the Skies. I like 4 Scry the Skies, but it depends on what you're looking for in your build. Some people like to run Wisdom's Reprise instead, and I think that's a really good option late game. The problem is you can't use that to level from 1 to 2 to 3, and that's the whole purpose of the Scry the Skies package, is declumping your hand, debricking your hand, and Wisdom's Reprise doesn't exactly do that. Turbocharge is an option for when you want to be a little bit greedy and you don't expect to die very quickly. You, instead of turbo leveling, you can choose to just materialize a backup charger early, pay for a backup charger, make a power cell, recollect, play turbocharge, end your turn, and you are up so many cards over your opponent, and you also have 3 in your memory ready to level up the next turn. So depending on the matchup, I may or may not want to keep a turbocharge in my opening hand. The next 10 slots I like to attribute to anti-meta slots. I personally put 4 Incapacitate and 4 Resolute Stand in every single Luxem Zander deck that I build, and the next 4 slots are depending on the meta. Sometimes I like to play Underfire, sometimes I like to play Vanish from sight, sometimes I like to play anti-Spell Shroud, Spell Shroud options, but the one I want to talk about today is Topsy Decree. I've went first on my last 2 local events, and one of the first place scenarios was solely off the back of a Topsy Decree. Against aggro, what they'll do nowadays is they will ping you for a lot of spell damage early on in the game. If they pay 2, if they pay 3 in order to deal 4 damage to you with a spell, in response, you can imbue Topsy Decree, give yourself Spell Shroud, and then rip a card from their hand or memory. What this does is it basically nullifies their damage, but it also puts them down 2 cards and only down 1 card for you. This means that they'll run out of gas quicker, and Topsy Decree is instrumental in making sure that you can quickly gain that influence over them and then turn the corner. However, you can also use it against mid-range and control decks. How Topsy Decree is worded is the third mode is not a targeted mode. You can select on resolution. So what that means is if your opponent, and I did this to my opponent once, where they were leveling to Zander 2, and they wanted to clearly to pick up an assassin skill from their graveyard. I Topsy Decreed in response to that trigger, and I had them discard a card from the hand. In this case, it was an assassin skill, but even if it was an assassin skill, and let's say they discard a second target, you can then have the third mode resolve after that and banish both of their targets so that they get nothing from their on-enter trigger except for 2 prep counters. Topsy Decree with the banish mode means that you can play conservatively and still react if your opponent wants to gain advantage over you. Let's say you're playing the mirror and both of you have Creative Shock and Float in hand. You can actually end your turn, and on your end step, your opponent will Creative Shock, discarding Float. After they do all that, you can imbue a Topsy Decree, have them discard another card from their hand, if it's a float even better, and then banish both of their float as well. So Topsy Decree means that it's a defensive spell. It's also a spell that allows you to keep an influence advantage over the course of the game. I am currently running 2. I may consider running more in the sideboard in the future. It is a very strong card. Now, if you play Luxem Zander consistently at your locals, players at your locals will probably start to sideboard against you or even mainboard heavily against you. We all know that the big boogeyman in the room is Regal Inquisition being used against Luxem Zander. If you have 2 Lightweaver's Assaults, a bunch of Luxem Sights, and a Gleaming Cut or whatnot, and they Regal you, it's very difficult to claw your way back from the game. However, what you can do is if you have a sideboarded Tabula Salvage, you can Tabula after they Regal you, put all of your Luxem cards back in your deck, and then use Luxor's map to essentially shuffle your deck and then fill it up with the cards you want to see again. If you see your opponent proactively using Regal on you all the time, you can even Luxor's map in advance. And you can only really do this against wind or sometimes even fire. You can Luxor's map in advance, and even after they Regal you, you can just pop the Luxor's map and search for your first Lightweaver's Assault again. Because you only really need 2 Lightweavers to win, and if you already have 2 in hand and a Luxor's map as well, you're basically insulating your win con. You can also just kill them with 3 Lightweaver's Assaults, but let's not go to there. A null spell is a good option against Regal Inquisition because it's basically a 5th and 6th copy of Incapacitate. Please note that Spell Shroud does not work against Regal Inquisition because Spell Shroud targets your champion, but Regal Inquisition targets you, the player. So Topsy Decree doesn't actually get around Regal Inquisition. You will need a null spell against Regal. So either you reactively respond with a null spell, or you proactively set up with Tabula Salvage plus Luxor's Map. If you really hate Regal Inquisition, you can also consider Orb of Regret. So you can Tabula Salvage, put all of your Luxem cards back in your deck, and then use Orb of Regret to essentially draw back all the Luxem cards that they had just gotten rid of with their Regal Inquisition. Safeguard Amulet is another good counter to Luxem decks. Nullifying Mirror is also a really good way for control decks to keep their hand against you. So for both of them, you can just reduce to Ash and destroy the Nullifying Mirror or destroy the Safeguard Amulet on their turn right before you go for the kill. So Return to Ash could be a mainboard option if your locals is prepared against your deck. Lastly, if your locals is building decks in order to counter Luxem's just ongoing healing with Luxem sites, they'll often go for a one-shot kill kind of move. Either it's a big swing with a CL deck, or it's a Storm Slime killing you with a bunch of damage on the stack. You can start mainboarding Crystallized Destiny in order to out those big swing effects. You can also use these in conjunction. So for example, a good counter to Crystallized Destiny is just to ping 1 point of damage to break the spell shield on you. You can actually just annul spell a lot of those options away unless it's a skill, in which case you need an incap. So you not only do you want to build your deck, you want to make sure that your deck is well prepared if your opponents are building around you. So I typically want 2 to 4 options in my deck to do just that. Currently, I'm using Reduce to Ash for my 2 slots. The next thing is to consider what your locals is comprised of. If your locals is comprised of a hybrid, a good mix of aggro, mid-range, control, you might not want to go too crazy with the ally hate. But if your entire locals is ally hate, you might want to consider some mainboarded or sideboarded options against allies. One that I really like is actually Flame Sweep. You don't see this very often, but you could exploit vulnerability pre-recollection, target yourself, give yourself Death Touch, and then on your main phase, you just Flame Sweep the whole board and you destroy all of your opponent's allies. You can also, let's say for example, you draw the Flame Sweep, but you don't have exploit vulnerability. If you have the room, you can mainboard an Assassin's Ripper, so you can Flame Sweep for essentially 4 damage, which usually wipes the board there as well. A nice side effect is if you're mainboarding exploit vulnerability, it means that things like Mercenary's Blade is a lot more impactful. You could essentially just, My apologies. You can essentially just prepare, exploit vulnerabilities, target yourself, and then even without any other cards in your hand, if you have the prep counter, you can pay for a Mercenary's Blade and just swing and destroy an ally with only one card. It's pretty good value. Next, we have our Hosers. These are cards that you can actually consider if one particular matchup is giving you trouble. So in the Slimes format, we didn't really have Crystallized Destiny. We didn't have any outs or answers to Storm Slime. In those formats, we used to run Dusk-like Communion, and we banish an Umbra card to essentially give our opponents -1 level. What this means is that all of the Pride 3 allies, and that's Ethereal Slime, that's Storm Slime, they can't attack. So even if they build a big board, they will not be able to attack and give that pressure and put that pressure on you with Dusk-like Communion. This actually got buffed with the Looking Glass package because now you can run things like Inert Sword, you can run things like Bauble of Scarcity, and you can still use them as banished targets for Dust-like Communion. A nice side advantage of this is if you're giving your opponents -1 level, this also affects players like Arisana, who have thresholds where they have to be level 3 or they have to be at a certain level to resolve their effects. So Dust-like Communion is a decent option if you want to really have the hate against slimes and sometimes against Arisana in particular. Sometimes decks with skill pilots like Jin, they might give you trouble, and you can just mainboard a Caliburn of Silencing, or sideboard it in, and just turn off the immortality effect on the turn that you'd kill them, and they just die. You can use this against slimes as well, because if you turn off the Sylvie effect of being able to play advanced element slimes, they can't storm slime you. And then lastly, you can use self-foraging on your Caliber of Silencing in order to do it again turn after turn. So these are not common options you'd see. However, they might be something you want to consider if one particular player in locals is giving you trouble. And sometimes when you start to add all of these elements together, you start to create a kind of a mini engine. Let's say, for example, if we have the flame sweep from before, and we're using things like inert sword or whatnot to be able to use flame sweep to clear a board of allies, flame sweep costs 4, light weaver's assault costs 4, incapacitate costs 4. What this means is that you can actually use things like Rictus Tiding to reveal 4 cost cards on the top of your deck, and then draw both of them into your memory. And if you're already running things like the Looking Glass, you can use something like Reckoning's Wake in order to manipulate the top cards of your deck in order for Rictus Tiding to hit more consistently. So these are not common options, and you might not always have the space. However, in the list I showed you earlier with 47 cards, you should be able to have enough space to put in everything. All you have to do is take out maybe the Scry Disguise for a Rictus Tiding package, and you'd be able to fit in some of these hosing options. Lastly, you could even go for a taxes option, or like a kind of a stifling option to play Luxem. You could, if your entire locals is comprised of mid-range allies, for example, you could play something like a sideboarded Art of War or a mainboarded Art of War, and maybe even some copies of Chibi, which is basically a permanent terraframe. It'll make it so that it's difficult for them to get value off their allies. It'll tax them for attacking with allies, and then late game, when you're ready to go for the kill, you can just use Art of War to pay for the cost of an Orb of Hubris, for example, and that way you can just straight up draw into your Luxem cards. If you want to play a more grindy game, you can play something like Orb of Glitter, even to just look at the top card of your deck consistently, if you really want to dig for specific options. Oasis Trading Post is another one. If your locals is comprised of all control, they're very slow decks, you have all the time in the world, you can just resolve one Oasis Trading Post and be able to glimpse on your opponent's end step consistently every single turn. If your opponent is running some sort of allies there, you could use Oasis Trading Post to hit specific breakpoints. Let's say, for example, your opponent has a 2-3 ally, and you only have one Light Weaver's Assault available to you. On your opponent's end step, you can pay for Oasis Trading Post, put 5 into it, in order to create a 1/1 token. On your turn, you reveal Light Weaver's Assault. You can deal 2 damage to the ally and then use your token to finish it off. It just helps you hit certain breakpoints. So that's another option to consider if your local meta is very slow. Lastly, if you want to force your local meta to play to your tempo, you can consider Tri-Castles of Lucinia. This is a new card that essentially says, hey, if you're running all wind, if you're playing a Razor Gale deck, or if you're playing all water, and you're playing a very streamlined water deck, you will not be able to play cards unless you pay to the tax of Tri-Castles. Um, Popping this on the right board against the right opponent is very difficult for them to remove. However, I will say this is not a main board option because you do lose to Exia decks and you do lose to Neos decks. And some other decks as well, Rye decks as well, they will love it if you play Tri-Castles against them. So this is a sideboard option more so than any main board option available to you. Lastly, you can just play whatever gives you joy, whatever is fun. For me, that's Uther. For me, that's Gawain. They're not bad cards. We have enough slots in our deck to just play our pet cards. Uther in particular is very funny because you can actually target a Fate Stone object and remove it even before they flip because it's not a skill. It's an on enter trigger. They can't even. It's very difficult to get around an Uther. So Uther interacting with Fate Stones is absolutely funny to me. Lastly, there are options that you might want to consider in a very narrow format, or if one particular player is basically trouncing you every single game. If you're constantly losing to a Crux player, for example, you might want to consider Heavenly Guide. That way you can just level to 3 in response to their DG. If a Tristan player is giving you problems, you might want to consider Staggering Strike, because if you Staggering Strike them early, it's very difficult for them to be able to have the prep gen to be able to level up efficiently. Instead of Staggering Strike, you can also consider the new card Stolen Chance. So in response to the level 2 level up trigger, you can just take away one of their prep counters, you draw a card, they don't draw an extra card. It's a small guy, I don't really like this one, but it is there. Speaking of small effects, Surreptitious Scheme is really nice if your opponent is playing Kingslayer Merlin, because on the beginning of turn trigger, with the gain a counter and then draw a card, you can actually use Surreptitious Scheme in response and make it so that they're not auto even or whatever it is that they want to be able to get the draw effect, and then that way you draw a card and they don't draw a card. That's a nice little small advantage option as well. Underfire smokes certain decks. For example, CL with their Mastery means that every time they swing with 5+ omens, they draw a card into the memory. But if they play an attack card and they rest their champion, you can play Underfire in response. They will not be able to declare an attack. They lose their attack card, and because they're rested, they can't even attack with a weapon, so you stop them from gaining the effects of their Mastery for one turn. Verrocan Acolyte means that if you have a Diana play at your locals, you can just target their spell shrouded the spell shrouded bow and destroy it. No questions asked. So Verrocan Acolyte's great for that. If you have a player where you really want to resolve a Nullifying Lantern against, you can consider swapping out a fire in your sideboard. You take out 4 Creative Shocks, you put in 4 Factorize, and instead of the Serene Fire, you put in Serene Water. So that way, if you're Nullifying Lantern mid-game and they decide to destroy it, you can just Factorize your own Nullifying Lantern. You can also do this against Diana, where if the Wind Diana player, for example, is using Zephyr to suppress their DG and then level to 3. That's not Zephyr, it's a Reclaim. What's the one? They're using the turbo leveling to 3 and then using the Shadow's Twin to put curses on you. In response to the Shadow's Twin trigger of gaining +2 attack, you can fracturize the gun with the bullet still inside, and it'll kill both of them. So that's a neat little trick for the ALC format players out there. Lastly, if you're really struggling to Shenju, you can consider just running Ensnaring Fumes. I've heard of some crazy people putting in Imperial Seal just to be able to resolve the Ensnaring Fumes as well. Ensnaring Fumes is just so good against Shenju, it's crazy. Lastly, if you're If you lose the mirror a lot, you might want to consider the mirror and nullifying mirror because it's very helpful against the Luxem matchup to make sure that you get to keep your hand even if they're revealing Luxem against you. Orb of Sealing is good against slimes. It's also good against Rye, if that's giving you trouble. So this particular page of cards is only if there's someone that really ticks you off at locals that you want to side against. And with that, that's everything I wanted to talk about today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope this gave you some ideas on how to build your deck going into this upcoming format. Hope you have a lot of fun. Until next time.